In this video, I'm going to talk about the double recorder, a little about the history of the instrument, about my particular instrument, how it's fingered, the different keys it can play in, the way I adapt music to play on it. The double recorder, of course, was a medieval instrument. We can see in medieval illustrations that double pipe instruments were quite ubiquitous in the Middle Ages. And there's even one surviving example of a double recorder from the mid-15th century that was found in a river in Oxford that looks not unlike this instrument. Now, the double recorder can play most medieval repertoire quite easily, as it just has a drone and a melody with a small range. But as music became more sophisticated, these double pipe instruments were found to be unable to play the sorts of modulations, the different keys, the wide range that was required. There's even a late 15th century author, Tinctorus, who remarked that the double recorder was the most limiting woodwind existing, hardly fit for any music at all. And the instrument died out by the mid-16th century, except for some folk pipes that exist in certain corners of the world that play simple folk repertoire. Now, an early music purist would therefore consider that the double recorder is only suitable for playing medieval and early Renaissance repertoire. However, I myself am not a purist. I feel that it's worthwhile to experiment with playing later music on an early instrument to see what results can be had. And I've actually found that this double recorder, which is a chromatic instrument, is really quite capable of playing Baroque and even Romantic music. I've put a lot of thought into how to adapt that repertoire to this instrument, and particularly with regards to Baroque dances, I found that it's really extremely suitable for it and gives very pleasing results. My instrument was made by Yuri Terenyi in New Zealand. It's made of almond wood. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how this instrument is fingered. It's got some unique qualities. There's only a few people in the world who make double recorders, and each of them makes it differently, and each has its own advantages and disadvantages. This instrument has a very interesting left-handed pipe, which is capable of playing a full octave from F to F without any overblowing. Overblowing is almost completely impractical in a double instrument, in large part because every note has to play at the same air pressure, because you need to be able to play high notes with one hand, low notes with the other hand, and so forth, without changing how hard you blow in order to keep both pipes always in tune. This is of course quite different from an ordinary recorder, where one blow is harder on the high notes and weaker on the low notes. In order to make it feasible to get as much range as possible without any change in air pressure, Yuri makes these pipes with a very unusual reverse conical bore. That is to say, if you look at this end of the pipe, you can see that the left-hand pipe is wide and the right-hand pipe is a little bit narrower, whereas at the opposite end we see that the left-hand pipe is narrow and the right-hand pipe is wide, meaning that the right-hand pipe has the typical inverted conical bore of a recorder, getting narrower towards the end. The left-hand pipe has the opposite of that. It has a forward conical bore, getting wider towards the end. Quite a unique invention, and it seems to work well to keep the finger spacing comfortable. Now on the left-hand pipe here, the lowest note is F, and it's fully chromatic up to high F. The right-hand pipe, I've made some modifications to it. You can see that there's various holes here that have been filled in with wax. The reason for that is, with any double instrument, the big question is, what is the relationship between the right and left pipes? When Yuri made this instrument, he made it so that the two pipes were in fifths. That is to say that if you're on all fingers down on the left pipe, F, and all fingers down on the right pipe, you were playing B flat, and so on. Equal numbers of fingers would give you fifths up and down. It makes a good deal of sense for medieval music, where the music is often in fifths, but I found several difficulties for myself with this fingering arrangement. For one thing, it meant that the right-hand pipe was fingered entirely different from a soprano recorder, whereas the left-hand pipe is fingered quite similarly to a soprano recorder. That is to say, F, G, A, B, same as a soprano recorder. But down here we had B flat, C, D, completely different from a soprano recorder. I found that maddeningly difficult for sight-reading music. The other problem that I found was that these bottom holes were so small that they didn't vent the sound very well. It meant that the bottom notes, the B natural and the C, had a rather unstable, weak sound to them. So I decided to modify the right-hand pipe, moving the hand position up one hole, such that the two pipes are now in fourths. So C, D, E, F natural, F sharp, G, which means that my right-hand pipe now fingers very similarly to a soprano recorder. So here we have the G in both hands. So to demonstrate, the lowest note being C, and chromatically, I also drilled a large thumb hole, which allows me to get A flat, A, B flat. So this has almost a complete octave, B flat at the top, C at the bottom, and I find it quite intuitive to finger as a recorder player. Interestingly, in the 19th century, there existed another double-piped flute called a double flageolet. It was popular among wealthy amateur musicians in England in the first half of the 19th century. And this instrument had the right-hand position even one step higher still, such that if you had the same number of fingers on each pipe, you would be playing in parallel thirds. It gave a very sweet sound to the instrument, made it quite easy for amateurs to play who might really only be comfortable playing one line of music. They could play the same thing on both pipes and get a simple parallel third sort of harmony. Often these amateur musicians would be reading from tabulature rather than musical notation, and could handle only that very simple sort of fingering. So essentially we have three choices with a double instrument. The instruments could be in fifths, in fourths, or in thirds. And I think the choice of relationship probably has a lot to do with choice of repertoire. It would appear that the medieval double instruments were very often in fifths, and that makes sense for medieval repertoire, where you're generally holding a drone against a melody, or you're playing chords in parallel fifths. The parallel third position of the double flageolet makes a lot of sense for romantic 19th century harmonies, sort of the kind of harmonies you see in simple hymns and popular songs of the era, which are very heavy on parallel thirds. Whereas this intermediate position that I've chosen, where the pipes are in fourth, I find that quite pleasing from a compositional standpoint, because it means that I have a fair number of parallel thirds within the range of the pipe. That is to say, there's enough overlap that I can play quite a few notes in parallel thirds, but there's also enough separation between the pipes that I can play quite a few intervals in parallel sixths. And as a result, I can do a lot of contrapunctal movement where I'm going down one way and up the other way. I'm now going to talk a bit about the different keys in which this instrument can play. Being almost fully chromatic, one could theoretically play it in any key. However, the practicalities of the range and fingering are such that there's really only 3 or 4 keys that work comfortably on it, and each has its advantages and disadvantages that are interesting to know about with regards to choosing what key to arrange what piece of music in. I'm going to start with the key of G major, which I find to be in a sense the natural key of the instrument, the key that is most comfortable to finger and which uses the least cross fingerings, the one that I can play in fastest and most easily. Although it's a fairly limited key in terms of its range, most of the music I arrange is in the key of G major. The advantage of the key is that the keynote, G, is in the center of its range, so there's a lot of opportunity for contrapunctal harmony, one part going down, the other part going up, and so forth. In the right-hand pipe, one can go all the way down to the subdominant, all the way down to C, which is most useful for harmony. And on the left-hand pipe, we can go down to one note below the keynote, which is also extremely useful for dances and folk melodies. The disadvantages of G major is that I can't use the top notes of either pipe, because the top note on this pipe is B flat, which doesn't fall in the G major key. Top note of this pipe is F natural, also doesn't fall in the G major key. Here's a small demonstration of what the key of G major sounds like. One advantage of G major is that its relative minor, E minor, works quite well also, particularly because I have the D sharp leading tone of E minor. So I can go directly from what you heard there into its relative minor. And back to a relative major. As another example of contrapunctal harmony and use of relative minor, those two things giving music its Baroque sound, here's my arrangement of The Siege of Buda, a folk song from 1686, which drifts briefly into the relative minor in the B part. G minor is also an extremely effective key. It has all of the advantages of G major, but also has a bigger range, because now my top note, B flat and F, fit within the scale. So I can use every single note on the pipe when playing in G minor. I can also play very effectively in melodic minor, that is to say with the 6th and 7th degrees of the scale being sharp on the way up, flat on the way down, because I have F sharp, F natural, E natural, E flat. And as a demonstration of melodic minor, I'll play my arrangement of one of the recorder pieces from the Gentile Companion of 1683. The next key I'll describe is the key of F major. F major also has the advantage of using the full range of the pipe, going all the way up to F natural, B flat. One advantage of F major over G major is that it has more parallel thirds. Which gives a very sweet sound to the harmony. It also has the advantage of going all the way up to the high keynote. As an example of music arranged with a lot of parallel thirds and showing off that large range, I'll play an excerpt from Hector the Hero. I've also found that the key of F major is extremely useful for playing songs and hymns, tunes that are meant to be sung, because those tunes very often go down to the low dominant and no lower, and they very often go up to the high tonic and no higher, a range of an octave and a fifth. As an example of one of these typical folk songs with that range, I'll play O Shenandoah. Lastly, I'll describe the key of D. D, whether it's major or minor, is an interesting key. It, in a sense, sounds the best on the instrument. It gives the most sonorous tonal quality to the chords. Now, most melodies played in the key of D are inevitably going to go both above and below the harmony, which can sound quite good, but it will inevitably obscure the shape of the tune if it's not highly familiar to the listener. As an example of a familiar tune that works quite well doing this, I'll play Old Joe Clark. And as a more elegant example of a song in D, here's two possible ways of harmonizing Wayfaring Stranger. very beautiful, but the melody is fairly obscured, but this works really well as a harmony when accompanying a singer. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the compositional techniques I use for my arrangements. It's difficult to find music that fits the double recorder right off of the page. Certainly some medieval music does, and some simple two-part arrangements of folk songs do. But of course the vast majority of melodies have a range of more than an octave and are going to need to drift from one pipe to the other or be compressed or inverted in some way. For a long time I was engaged in a search just for melodies that seemed to fit the pipe perfectly, thinking of that as the natural repertoire for the instrument. But later I found that actually the melodies that don't fit it very well result in a much more interesting composition. To have the melody occasionally drop the octave or drift into the other pipe and have a descant harmony on the upper pipe, that makes them much more interesting music. Let me give as an example one of the Playford dances, Bartholomew Fair. I'll play the melody as written on a regular recorder. Here's the A part. That can be harmonized with no problem on the double recorder. And now the B part, which goes quite high. So what I've done with that B part, that one measure that goes too high, I've dropped it an octave and put it in the right hand pipe with a descant harmony in the left hand. And you can hear that having some melodic movement in the right hand pipe gives that rich Baroque texture of the fast movement switching from one part to the other. Quite pleasing. Another technique when the melody drops into the right hand pipe is to simply leave out the left hand pipe and play it solo. This can work particularly well at the beginning of a tune where you want the shape of the melody to be clear. For instance, you can hear this in my arrangement of Loch Lomond. When I'm arranging a multi-part composition for the double recorder, I frequently have to compress and rearrange the parts extensively to fit the range, trying to retain the sense of movement of the fast-moving notes switching from one part to another that is so typical in Baroque music. I've found that with such compositions, it's remarkable the extent to which one can move one part or the other from the top to the bottom, transpose a part up a third, down a third, up a sixth, as long as one retains the structural balance of fast-moving part versus slow-moving harmony, reversing and so forth. The piece can very much maintain its character even when it's essentially completely recomposed and bears little resemblance to the original. This Baroque bourrée that I arranged is an example of that, where it has the sound of the original, even though it's almost entirely recomposed, the parts transposed and condensed all over the place. couple of aspects of the playing technique on this instrument. Expression is somewhat different from a regular recorder. Of course, one has relatively little ability on this instrument to blow harder or softer to change the volume, because there's really only one wind pressure that keeps it playing in tune with itself. And secondly, you can't articulate by tonguing every note, because often you have notes moving in one hand and not moving in another hand, and you don't want to over-articulate and keep making the harmony note start and stop because you're trying to tongue the melody note, which is why I play with a articulated, ornamented technique, similar to what is typically used on a bagpipe or a penny whistle, for exactly the same reason, that you want your airstream to continue moving and articulate with ornamentation alone. I myself play the bagpipe and the penny whistle, so this comes quite naturally to me, though it would not be so typically how one would play a Baroque recorder. But a nice balance of articulation through tonguing and articulation through folk ornaments seems to be the ideal technique for expression on this. One last thing I'll talk about is tuning. This instrument is tricky to keep in tune, because as soon as it starts getting moist from the breath, the windway starts to close up, you have to blow a little bit harder, the tuning drifts around, and you may find that after a few minutes of playing, one side or the other is a little flat. This can be corrected for by tilting it left or right in the mouth to try to direct more air into one side or the other. So if I hear it starting to play with a beat, I can often correct the tuning. By finding the angle at which the instrument is happiest at that particular moment. I hope you've enjoyed my video and that this has expanded your horizons with regards to the music that is possible to play on a double recorder.